This evening we must develop the second part of our series of discussions, which is to deal primarily with the effect of the God concept on human health. We are not always able to understand or recognize the tremendous power of concepts upon not only conduct, but upon those daily happenings which seem to have no special rhyme or reason in themselves. We do not know just when the concept of God came to mankind. We realize that it arose in some parts of the world at a comparatively early date, but it was not a spontaneous generation of consciousness in man. It grew, it developed, it unfolded. And even after the human being began to recognize that there was some sovereignty over the ghosts and spirits, beings and monsters of the primordial world, the clear-cut idea of a benevolent deity was not an immediate result. The first and oldest concepts of God were a more or less transitional group of beliefs. The deity was emerging in competition to a number of lesser tribal entities. Perhaps Egypt gives us as good a perspective on this as any other country. In fact, Egypt probably perpetuated this strange conflict longer than almost any other nation recorded to us. In Egypt, religion was more or less local, and even at the heights of the power of this great kingdom, the gods belonged to areas and vicinities called nomes, or small provinces. Each province had its own deity, or group of deities. Gradually there was increasing tolerance, and those who in various exchanges of living traveled, or lived in bounding areas where countries or states came together, learned more and more of the gods of their neighbors. It is therefore also true that deistic philosophies and theologies had a tendency to spring up along caravan routes, or wherever there was intercourse between otherwise isolated groups. In Egypt, the nome deities became the patron divinities of areas. But by degrees, in the course of their political history, the Egyptians passed through a number of changes. One by one, these nomes became important. Perhaps, in one case, a certain nome gained almost complete sovereignty over the entire country. Under such conditions, its gods increased in importance, until finally, out of these local deities, there gradually emerged a number of divinities that came to be generally worshipped. And these were added to the local pantheon. In time, for example, Osiris attained to this dignity, as did also Amun-Re. Both of these gods were originally local deities. Nearly all of the concepts of the great gods that we have today began with local divinities whose prestige increased when the nations to which they belonged gained political or military ascendancy. Thus these gods, very often, at least in the earlier phases of the development of theology, combined numerous attributes. Like the typical deities of the Greeks and Romans in popular mythology, The gods were a more or less mixed blessing. They had their strong points and also their weaknesses. And if they had authority, they did not always exercise morality. The gods, in other words, were not very different from the people who worshipped them. And the concept of a larger philosophical integrity to which men might aspire, but which they had not yet attained, this had not dawned upon primordial mankind. For general purposes and in survey, however, we can say that there was a gradual tendency for the gods of various regions to group into patterns, and in time certain deities gained ascendancy or authority. Perhaps this concept was based upon terrestrial conditions. Men were governed by strong rulers who seized the land by conquest or secured it through arbitration and diplomacy. These rulers held splendid court. They had various officers under them, chamberlains and ministers. They also had their governors in various provinces. And the intricate system of human administration came to be recognized as a symbol of the way heaven was managed, until by degrees God, in the form of the emperor or of the supreme human person, attained autocracy, became the splendid embodiment of all of the autocratic, even despotic practices of mankind. Thus a supreme being of some kind was recognized long before this being was regarded as being particularly concerned with the affairs of average mortals. The gods in the beginning lived in their own world. Perhaps they managed the heavy responsibilities of the cosmos, but it did not occur to the average citizen that these gods were any more approachable to by him than his emperor or any of the great officials of his state. Therefore, it was customary for common folks to make appeals through secondary divinities or through local godlings who might carry the message to the more august divinities. This process of selecting intermediaries or messengers or ministering spirits between God and man has continued throughout the world and is still preserved to us in the canonization of saints, and the saint as an emissary or intermediary through whom the prayers of man might reach to the ear of heaven. In some nations, the emperor came to be deified, as in China, where the emperor carried the title the Son of Heaven. Genghis Khan, the great Mongol conqueror, also carried this title, and Alexander the Great said that he would like to have, except that he still recognized in himself too many frailties of the flesh. During the outstanding period of Roman success, the emperors were worshipped as divinities. And one of the reasons for the persecution of the Jews during the 1st century BC was that they refused to worship the emperor of Rome instead of their own racial deity. So by degrees, the concept of God began to take form, first merely as an autocrat, as a great, powerful being whose contact with humanity was slight or indifferent. A God who did as he pleased, as kings did, to whom the problem of right and wrong was not important because there was no one who could control him. Human beings like to think of that as a possible destiny for themselves. They like to look forward to the time when they could do as they pleased and no one could interfere. They could not, but their God could. And for a time that was why they worshipped him as God, simply because he was stronger than they were. Perhaps the first human being in history who began to reform and moderate and idealized the God concept was the Pharaoh of Egypt. Others earlier may have existed, but we are not sure of them. Certainly he was one of the first to conceive of one universal God, completely separate from all sects and creeds, completely non-tribal, non-racial, completely beyond the influence of man so far as the limitation of the God's virtues was concerned. Akhenaton therefore selected for this deity the symbol of the sun, not because its light was the brightest, but because its light shone upon all things. The sun brought its warmth and the brightening power of its rays not only to the fields of the man who believed in one faith, but equally to the fields of the man who believed in another faith. Therefore Akhenaton became aware that the rain rained on both the just and the unjust, that in some mysterious way God was no respecter of persons. This discovery began to change the course of man's thinking, for it began to introduce to him a new concept of the divine plan. This concept saved him or preserved him from an older belief, namely that the Lord was against him. Primitive man, looking at the universe, dominated by his fetishes, his talismans, and his fears, lived in an almost constant state of anxiety. Such religion as he had was to propitiate evil, to make possible survival under a concept that only through making offerings or paying tributes could he survive. Thus, fear of the unknown, fear of sickness, fear of darkness, fear of death, fear of storms and of peace, caused a tremendous psychic tension in primordial mankind. This psychic tension expressed itself through a desperate faith, a faith supplicating for mercy, a faith which caused the individual to feel that he was less than nothing, that he had no rights, no privileges, and no power, that he could expect no justice. He could only blindly beseech. He could pray that good would come to him. He could pray that evil would be kept from him. But his prayer was not the prayer of a person who had faith, but the desperate utterance of an individual who knew no other way to reach the unknown except to speak to it, to raise his voice in the air, hoping that some spirit would hear, and perhaps hoping that the ghosts of his own dead would repent of their persecution and take pity upon him, as he in turn might take pity upon some other living creature. Thus fear brought with it a religion of tremendous tension. It brought with it no integrated hope about the afterlife. And as Homer tells us, the most humble peasant alive was better and happier than great Achilles dead. The spirits of the dead went into a ghost land where there was no future and no past. The ancient people did not believe in hell as we know it. They did not believe in punishment. They simply believed in a continual survival in the shadow. Nothing going anywhere, nothing doing anything. Only wandering on and on through space, through an eternity of shadow, uncertainty, darkness. These things certainly would make men fear to die. Other people believed that the deceased person would simply continue to live as he lived here. So they buried his goods and certain things that he might find useful with him. Sometimes they killed his horses and buried them. Sometimes they killed his wives. Not infrequently, they killed the entire community so that he could have his entire people with him after death. Such beliefs as these could certainly not bring with them a great and enduring optimism. And primitive methods, therefore, of belief and healing had certain psychological grounds in common. Men believed that sickness was due to the evil thoughts, evil actions, evil schemes of others or of beings, not human. There was no concept of a relationship between sickness and justice. In fact, man has always had trouble with that. There's hardly a week goes by in which someone doesn't come to me and say, why should this have happened to me? I'm a good-hearted individual. Man has never been able to sense completely any relation between conduct and health. He can intellectually affirm it, but when the time comes, he's inclined to slip back into his atavistic instincts and simply feel that suffering, sickness, evil, all these things are spiteful occurrences, and he is a victim of some injustice, either human or divine. So living in a world of injustice, expecting nothing more, with no codes of law suitable to integrate society, we do have this great overshadowing anxiety, fear, the unknown, the mysterious, against which men could build only strange tensions, phobias, frustrations within themselves. And against these, in turn, the witch doctor, the medicine priest, with his masks, his dances, and his rites, sought to give the individual the kind of therapy that he could understand. Perhaps that was all the physician also understood. There was no rhyme or reason in the sickness, therefore there need be no rhyme or reason in the cure. Anything that might help, might help. No one could be sure. After Akhenaten in Egypt, and with the rise of the great sects of philosophy in India and China, and the ultimate emerging of the classical Greek schools, it remained in a wonderful way for philosophy to put religion in order. Philosophy did not destroy religion. It supplied man with a series of ethical convictions, and these in turn man himself immediately imposed upon his theology. The moment man became a reasonable being, his God became a reasonable being. He could not worship that which was less than himself. Now this does not mean that man invented God as a reasonable being, but that man experienced him in that way. And until man could experience him in that way, God could not exist in that way for that man. So by degrees, growth and unfoldment changed the complexion of things. And by the 5th or 6th centuries BC, even as early as the time of Pythagoras and Hippocrates of Kos, Greek philosophy in the West, Buddhism, Vedanta, yogic philosophies in the East, the wisdom of China, as expressed in the teachings of Lao Tzu and Confucius, and in Persia in the wisdom of the Zoroasters, all these forces and pressures, many of them on a philosophical level, began to give man a concept of a good universe. A universe which was ruled over by a God, who was God not because he was great, but because he was good. Of course, even theology got mixed up a little in some of these problems, and we have a very famous scholastic brain teaser, which has never been completely solved, relating to the nature of good and of God. The question being, is a thing good because God wills it, or does God will a thing because it is good? This becomes quite a confusing issue, much more complicated than the words may first sound. But in any event, God became superior to man, or was experienced as a superior being, not because it was stronger, not because it had killed more enemies, not because it had floated victoriously over a city and protected that city from its adversaries, but because this being was good, had virtue that man did not possess, but aspired to possess. And as man's aspirations clarified, he bestowed upon deity all these good qualities. Now, of course, good in those days was a little dim as a term. And many of the things then considered good we would not accept as good today. But still they were good, as far as those people knew and as far as they could understand. With the coming of a good God, man began to feel the strength of the universe. He began to realize a kinship with a plan. This good God became the archetypal father. He was like a good father. And the God symbol was transferred from the remote monarch to the proximate parent. Instead of the monarch being the symbol of majestic divinity, the parent became the symbol of immediately available good, protection, love, understanding, fellowship. Men still considered deity as a strange and remote thing, but he began to take on a friendlier and more concerned relationship with mankind. It seemed perfectly probable and reasonable that a good God should want his people to be happy, that therefore all things that tended to happiness came from the good God. Now, men long before our time, or even before the classical period, had to fight through the mystery of the principle of good and evil. They had to decide in their own minds why evil existed if God was good. That has always been a question, and for many sects it has never been solved. Was it possible that there were two gods, one good and one bad, and that these two fought forever in space, someday one a little more victorious, another day the other more victorious? If we accept such a concept, we fall into what is called anthropomorphism, a belief which is still strongly expounded in certain of the Persian philosophies, and to a degree survives in many of the sects of Christianity. One of the old saints said, "Oh, blessed salvation that has given us a demon." If there wasn't a demon, there'd be no need for salvation. So the whole problem of man trying to save himself implies that he has to save himself from something. And he certainly doesn't have to save himself from the good God. So if he has to be saved, then there has to be something besides the good God involved in it. Now, other people, way back in the old days, began to reason like this. If God is all-powerful and all good, how can there be a bad God? And if there is a bad God, is he not just a little better than the court jester? I mean, he can have no real authority. Because if he is better than the good God, then the bad God is God. And the universe is ruled by evil. So the bad God cannot be stronger than the good one. And after a time, philosophy began to work out the problem, and began to explain to people that there was a good God and that good is real, but that the so-called bad God was really the badness in themselves as people, opposing the will of God. That doubt and hate and selfishness, these were attitudes which made things bad. And as a result of that, man was the cause in large measure of his own misfortunes. This helped in several ways. First of all, it clarified and sustained and vindicated the good God. And the second thing it did was to impose upon man certain responsibilities. If he wanted to be happy, he must make certain progress within himself and overcome those instincts which were destructive to his security. This was clarified fairly well by the time that Greek philosophy reached its ascendancy. So for at least in one part of the world, this doubt was laid to rest, and the good God came into more or less complete acceptance. One other step we should mention, and that is, as concepts of the good God evolved, something had to be done with the concepts that were left behind. People do not all change together. Our particular community might believe in the good God, but the next community was still worshipping the Olympian hierarchy, which feasted and banqueted and variously imposed its arbitrary wills upon human beings. The answer was through interpretation. Philosophy began to teach men that the older gods were really only symbols, imperfect, incomplete in man's imagination, but parts and mysterious attributes of the true God, and that therefore, again, older religions did not mean that there were older gods that vanished away, but older ideas about the eternal God that changed as men grew. This seemed reasonable to the more reasonable people, so that the process went on, and little by little new religions found it possible to proselyte among older faiths without creating too much antagonism. Perhaps the most perfect example of a doctrine reinterpreting older doctrines is Buddhism, which spread throughout Asia on this basis. And another more local but very intensive program in this direction was that of the Neoplatonists of Alexandria in the early centuries of the Christian era. But by degrees, the good God came to be the dominant concept. And because this deity was good, every good thing was associated with him. And what more good thing could be than health? And it became obvious to these people, in their first exuberant optimism, that God wanted everyone to be well. The deity naturally bestowed health. That God was not responsible for sickness. That God could not be directly responsible for anything crooked, deformed, broken, or imperfect. There had to be some other reason. And by this time, most of the more progressive people had also reached the point where they refused to believe in a principle of evil strong enough to counterbalance the good God, and therefore to force its own purposes upon mankind. Out of this came a concept, a new basic conviction, to take the place of the old one, which was fear. And now we have the world moving inevitably and resolutely toward faith. Faith was the inevitable result of man experiencing a divine principle worthy of his veneration. This good God could do anything. And more than that, this good God would only do that which is good. The second part was the improvement. The earlier tyrannical deity could do most anything it pleased. But the good God pleased only to do good. This meant that man did not have to defend himself against his universe. He did not have to defend himself against the invisible world around him, the heavens and the earth. These were good. So instead of being placed in a defensive position, man was invited to understand. He was invited to grow, and was assured that his knowledge about things would only increase his faith. The more he understood, the more he would believe. And the greater his belief, the greater his personal security. On this concept, therefore, came the beginning of a new kind of spiritual therapy. Faith, as we all realize, is an emotion without tension. Perhaps faith is the one emotion that the individual can experience against which he does not have to build resistance. Faith does not make him fear or worry or doubt. Faith does not force him to an immediate course of dramatic or intense activity. Perhaps faith, as in the religious dance, will cause him to dance all night. But it is not the dance of fear, it is a dance of joy. It is not a supplication that the God will not destroy. It is a statement of positive affirmation that we know that this God will preserve. Religion, therefore, became a joyful acceptance of happiness, not a wistful, tragic struggle against inevitable distress, and darkness. Thus therapy under religion also changed, and man began to experience the tremendous therapeutic effect of relaxation. Relaxation meant, in one way, in early times, a rather simple, kind of primitive thing, which perhaps we would consider today a little foolish, but it was there as part of the general psychic picture. We've often heard the old theological statement, cast your burdens on the Lord. Now, to cast your burdens on the Lord more or less meant for you to transfer your center of strength from your own nature to the divine nature. Anything that man could not do of himself that was good, the good God could do. Therefore, to each person and in every emergency, God and one constituted a majority. Also in this course of developing the concept of the good God, religious experience had become more imminent, more immediate. Primitive man was afraid to welcome the gods into his house, because they might eat him out of house or home or abduct his favorite daughter. He didn't know. But after the good God came along, he was a welcome visitor. And his image, his symbols, his songs, his prayers, were appropriate parts of home furnishing. Everyone believed in him. They wanted him. They loved him. Therefore, God came into the home and out of the temple. And even in the period of Greek religion, when the temples were magnificent structures, we are told from ancient historians that people very seldom went to the temples except on festival occasions. People did not go to church in those days. Nothing as what we call a church was known to exist. They worshipped almost completely in their own homes. The home was the sanctuary. The guardians of the temple in the home were the Lares and Penates, who lived usually, presumably, under the hearthstone. They guarded and protected the family. And the doors were never locked. And in old Greek houses of way back in those days, there were usually little symbols and inscriptions, magical writings on the doors, inviting the gods to come in. Any wandering deity that might come along was welcome at any time. This was because these people had outgrown the rather thieving and despicable tutelaries that had previously burdened their theology. Now deity came into life, came into the intimate experience of the people. Only on rare occasions did the populace actually go for private prayer to any public place. And when they did, it was usually to a grove or to some altar in the forest or by a stream where they would take their flowers and offerings. In the great classical period of religion, most faith consisted of offerings of thankfulness. The mere fact of being alive became good. The possibility of being happy, of doing good things, of serving one another, all these virtues became good. And in the performance of these and in the natural benefits which he enjoyed from the abundance of nature, man found numerous opportunities to be grateful to the gods. Thus his gratitudes divided sharply. He began to be less grateful, perhaps for the conduct of those around him, but more grateful for the benevolent protection of his deities. Thus in the religious healing, which we must gradually point in this direction, we have individuals letting go. They no longer tried to fight shadows. They no longer made strange incantations to protect themselves from spirits. They rather accepted the presence of an all-pervading spirit that would guard them, that would guide them. And they began to experience the importance of a complete faith in that spirit. If their faith was great enough, this faith itself made them whole. Today this is not bad psychology. Today we know that most of our troubles are due to tension. Faith is an antidote for tension. Faith relaxes muscles and nerves. Faith overcomes the disquietudes that cause insomnia. Faith also takes the place of those pressures which may result in chronic ailments and psychosomatic symptoms of one kind or another. Faith made man capable of living more normally and of finding great securities in the world around him. Now, when it came to faith as a religious therapy, we also come to notice another thing. By degrees, the individual turned to his good God more and more in every emergency that arose in his life. And throughout the world, shrines of faith began to take the place of the strange old temples of the elder gods. To these shrines of faith, people made pilgrimage. And I have seen in all parts of the world these shrines of faith. In the Muslim world, you will find a little building somewhere hidden on the edge of a desert or in an oasis. And perhaps like so much Muslim architecture, it has windows or screens made of intricately carved openwork marble. If it is a faith shrine, you will find that into each of these little carvings has been tied a piece of cloth or a piece of paper with a prayer on it, or with perhaps an offering of gratitude. And around the little building will be bowls of food and little paper flowers and small gifts of one kind or another. These represent the gratitude, the appreciation of the people. In the little town of Fatapachikri, not very far from Delhi in India, there is such a small healing mosque. And this mosque is visited annually by thousands of barren women who believe that by going there, they will be able to bear children. It is almost now like a coat of fur, because there are so many of these little cloth pieces tied to the numerous lattice works that they seem to hang like a coat over the entire structure. And each one of these thousands of little pieces of cloth testifies to the fact that that woman bore a child after she had been declared barren. Now, one thing we learn very early in this, and that is that these miracles of faith have absolutely nothing to do with creeds. The Chinese, going to their temple, have their prayers answered just as quickly as the most devout Christian. The Muslims, putting his little cloth into the lattice carving on the mosque, is just as surely answered as someone in the Western world who also offers his prayers or makes some offering for help and guidance. All over the world, the prayers of the faithful of 500 faiths have been equally answered. This takes us back to our old friend Akhenaton and his sun, which shines on everyone. And it seems that it is the faith itself and not the creed which brings about the fulfillment. It is the integrity within the person. And this integrity gives us now the foundation of what we may term the God healing. The healing of the individual whose health is restored very largely because of his conviction about deity, about the nature of deity and the power of deity in the life of the individual. We know that with the rise of Christianity, there was originally a great intensification of the belief in God as the great physician. In the epistles of St. James, the faithful are told to assemble and to bring the sick, and that they should pray together for the sick, and that their prayers will be answered. We know also that among the admonitions of Jesus to his disciples was that they should go forth and heal the sick in his name. Other holy men of the area, prior to or immediately after the advent of Christianity, were also similarly instructed by their own creeds and sects to heal the sick. And in almost all faiths it was a priestly function, and the individual firmly believed that by means of ordination into the religion he gained certain authority, not over sin alone, but also over sickness and death. Thus, in the early years of Christianity, we find a great emphasis upon the Christian ministry of healing, which was essentially a statement of faith, a statement of devotion or dedication, a clarification within the individual of the realization that God was good. This might be held and affirmed intellectually without much benefit, but if it was held with the simple and complete acceptance of a small child, without doubt or reservation, it accomplished some strange alchemy within the nature of man, and transformed many parts of the human body out of their debilities into a greater condition of health and security. Thus, this simple devotion to the good, this filling of one's life with belief in the good, changed chemistry, and we even today recognize beyond doubt that this is true, because according to the disturbances of the mind, so in many instances will be the disturbances of the flesh. With the gradual rise of the Christian Church, we have a continuing emphasis upon religion as healing. And we know that in the early years of the Church, the problem of the relationship of religion and the physician came under rather serious consideration. Such relationship was not regarded as incompatible, because we know, for instance, that St. Augustine was also a doctor. The problem of where physical medicine and spiritual medicine met, and also where they separated again, is worth a little thought. In the early days, when the church was growing up in a non-Christian world, the physician had already been established as a power in the Roman Empire. Professional physicians were available for the sick, and while their knowledge might today seem inadequate, perhaps the problems they faced were not as complicated as ours. In any event, they gained considerable reputation for skill, if not always for integrity. Thus the early church began to ponder this, especially in the light of the direct admonition of Jesus, that it was part of the apostolic duty to cast out demons, to cleanse the leper, to heal the sick, and even to raise the dead. Under such conditions, conflict might seem reasonable, but it was not. Essentially, a very serious matter at any time. even during the darkest ages of the Inquisition and the medieval world. The physician was not especially bothered or annoyed unless he got too close to theological problems. He was accepted. And one of the early saints reported on one occasion in the sermon that he gave that obedience to the physician is second only to obedience to God. Thus, we cannot say that the church discouraged the practice of medicine. I think what we can say, however, is that the church never dynamically encouraged it. It was primarily the purpose of the church to save the soul of man. And therefore the body was to the theologian of comparatively slight importance. He considered it as little better than a mark of original sin, and therefore hardly worth saving. Also, the inducements to preserve the body were not as great in those days. There was not as much to live for, and human beings were not nearly so addicted to life as we know it. They lived rather simple, not too thoughtful existences, heavily hazarded and burdened. Therefore, to them, perhaps, death was not as important as it would be to us. Also in the church from the beginning, sickness was regarded, strangely enough, as coming indirectly from God, because the early church had not solved the God-devil problem. The early church was still under a heavy psychosis of the reality of evil. But they could not and did not imply that deity was responsible directly for sickness. Rather, they held that sickness was due to original sin, that in some mysterious way, with Adam's fall, we sinned us all, as the small boy was taught in school, and that we were therefore paying mysteriously and strangely for some ancient primordial debt. We were paying because the sins of the fathers were visited upon the sons unto the third and fourth generation. Rather melancholy thinking, but it was strong in those days. Thus, if infirmities came to the flesh, the church suggested that the thing to do was to endure them with as much patience as possible. Actually, the more you suffered here, the more your glory would be in the world beyond. So the church was not militantly opposed to medicine, but it did not regard it as especially significant. The lack of cooperation between science and the early church undoubtedly set back the progress of scientific thinking for several hundred years and resulted in the possibility of a situation like the great bubonic plague or the Black Death that swept Europe periodically for 350 years. It was simply because these things must be borne with patience. They must be endured. The church had the conviction that this was a kind of testing ground, and that the individual must bear his burden and not make too many efforts to be relieved of it. This was a little conflicting because the church also believed that in the sacrifice of Christ, man was to a measure relieved of his burden of sin. But the doctrines were not too clear, and the church was gradually losing the optimism and the strange intimacy of man and God, which distinguished the great and golden age of classical philosophy. This had slipped away into the darkness due to the failure or disruption of the philosophic schools under the Emperor Justinian, and gradually learning reached a low ebb. As it reached a low ebb, man's mental ability to estimate values was reduced, lack of communication and transportation, isolation, and the rapid development of feudalism, and an almost unbroken pageantry of wars. All these things interfered with the growth of human consciousness and restricted man to rather limited perspectives. In any event, however, our primary consideration is the effect of the God concept on the essential nature of health. And this effect is also measured in terms of therapy, in the way in which remedies were developed and applied to various cases. One thing that we noted as this procedure unfolded was the introduction of prayer into healing practices. It became more and more customary for the medical school to open with prayer. It became customary for the physician to meet with his patient in prayer prior to the administering of remedies. It became also useful and considered very practical that large verses of Scripture and extracts from religious writings should be read to the sick, and professional readers or even priests frequently carried on this work. They did not interfere with the doctor, but they came and brought spiritual ministration to the sick individual. Thus medicine formed a rather close partnership, perhaps under the authority of the Hippocratic Oath of earlier days, which opened with a prayer addressed to all the gods and goddesses of the universe. So prayer became an important part of medicine. And prayer perhaps placed the patient in a more receptive attitude to therapy. Also, prayer became the source of a certain internal acceptance or integration. The individual who was sick found it to be practical, useful, helpful to make his peace with God. He did not know what the future of his disease might hold. And as Paracelsus pointed out in the 15th century, prayers at this time were most useful and should include a verse to the effect that the patient hoped that through the grace of God he might survive the remedy. In other words, there was some question as to whether the disease or the cure was most likely to be fatal. In this estate, we remember how medieval midwives, in order to hasten a slow delivery, would fire off a gun unexpectedly under the prospective mother's ear, hoping to frighten the child into existence. This type of thing was actually practiced and represents a situation in which prayers might be highly useful for all concerned. Having made peace, however, in himself with his God, man made peace with the greatest source of conflict in his own nature. For one thing, he put his conscience to rest. And conscience has always been a major cause of sickness. Now, conscience isn't always correct. And various individuals in various beliefs and on various levels of culture have had conscience troubles which could not be regarded as evidence of the presence of any common rule or pattern. The voice of conscience is not the voice of divinity. It is the voice of the individual's own integrity. If he violates it, he has trouble with himself. And nearly all sickness has, to a measure at least, some history in the direction of the individual who has had trouble with himself. If he hates himself, if he reproaches himself, if he knows within himself he has failed, or been untrue to principles which are real and important, if he has compromised his integrity, or if he carries a guilty secret in his heart, these things not only will make him sick, but if he is ill from any cause, will prevent recovery or slow down recovery. So through religion, man gained the concept that when sickness came, it was important to put himself right with the good God. And there are many cases in which, having completed the prayers, received the sacraments of his faith, the individual got up and got well. There is a case recorded within the last 3 years of a man who rose from his deathbed from a apparently hopeless ailment, and made a complete recovery after he had made his peace with God. Now, through thousands of years of experience, humanity has noted these things and has come to the conclusion that in some way prayer is a very important element in health. And prayer addressed to the good God has another tremendous psychological implication. To the devout person, prayer makes available the resources of God. Prayer is directly associated with mysticism, although all cults that practice it cannot be termed mystical. Prayer means to the individual the immediate availability of the presence of God. Prayer means that this ability to commune with or to reach through prayerfulness to the source of life makes this source available to us. In other words, if we pray in a spirit of contrition, simplicity, honesty, and honor, something happens. Now, various beliefs in various times and on various levels have tried to explain what happens. It may be a little too simple and a little too easy to simply affirm that prayer simply does bring man into so complete a contact with deity that healing the probabilities of healing are improved. It may be more than we can affirm. But certainly prayer does represent, again, a letting down or breaking down of internal barriers. Prayer also is a tremendous courage factor, and nearly all sick people are discouraged in some way. They have futility in their natures. Their very devitalization or the impairment of their functions and activities cause certain discouragement, causes them to feel more or less deserted or misused. Thus prayer becomes the availability of a power greater than that of the individual, something to set his life in order. Believing that through prayer this is possible, the individual becomes especially receptive to some kind of an answer to that prayer. Previous to this moment of prayerfulness, he may have been receptive only to such symptoms or such circumstances as contributed to his negation. He noticed only his bad symptoms and feared them, because primordial fear sets in whenever the unknown takes over the administering of our affairs. But having followed the ancient way, having fulfilled the law of his fathers, having done what the good and the true have done for ages before him, the individual becomes receptive to the recognition of good. He becomes capable of observing fortunate indications that his prayers are being considered or answered. Therefore, when some small or trivial incident occurs, it becomes magnified for good. Whenever there is a slight improvement, there is vast encouragement. Because all the things that seem to go a little better now bear witness to the inevitable and immutable and invincible power of God. Negative psychology is thus almost completely reversed. The individual begins to live upon the hope, or upon even more than hope, a kind of perhaps incomplete or imperfect certainty, but still a tremendous positive assumption that good things will happen. Also, the individual, in placing his destiny in the keeping of his God, takes the tremendous responsibility off of himself. Now, this may seem to be an evasion, and it perhaps is, but actually, it is taking the burden off of something that could never really handle it anyway. Because this thing which we call self is much more apt to be the cause of the sickness than the cure. This self, this egoism in man, which is so often the source of his rebellion against principles, and gradually develops some more and more negative attributes and attitudes. This sick self is not capable of assuring the recovery of the individual. Perhaps the mental habits are so deep set, the pessimism is so complete, that on the level of rationality, the mind or the self-consciousness in man could not solve the mystery. Where, therefore, such is true, rationalization is not particularly helpful. Something that breaks all the rules, cuts through all the patterns, something that seems to nullify the procedures that have themselves become hopelessly tangled and confused. This strange lightning flash, as Bamy called it, of something that cannot be analyzed, rescues the mind from its analytical tendencies and most of its negative attitudes. Thus, the tremendous impact of the reaction of man to his own faith has brought many a sick person back again to health. In these things, then, we have other attributes or aspects of the God-healing power, and we have the rise of the belief of the priest as physician. And as such, we find him in great many parts of the world, beginning with the primitive medicine priest who was both physician and spiritual guardian, and continuing on down. Why then do we observe perhaps so little emphasis upon religious healing in the modern world? With the exception of certain shrines, most of them under the direction or leadership of the Catholic Church, there are comparatively few centers of religious healing in Christendom. And even these healing shrines do not represent essentially a pattern within the church. They represent rather individual circumstances which are of the mind of the church. In other words, the church acknowledges the power of healing, but it sets up no machinery except that which may come through revelation, as in the case of the shrine at Lourdes. Actually, therefore, in Christendom today, with the exception of a few evangelical groups, there is no concerted health program. We can say, however, that the need has been recognized, for we are now finding a rising tendency toward the establishment of pastoral psychological counseling groups within churches. The church is beginning to recognize that a great part of the health problem of mankind is psychological and is due to conscience trouble, is also due to the inability of the individual to find a faith strong enough to combat the tensions of his daily living. Thus we have medicine or healing returning to religion via the road of psychology. And this will probably continue and expand. And more we will recognize the importance of the church as a counseling center. Another cause that has contributed to this change in recent years has been the tremendous complications within the field of medicine. Today, the average physician is unable to act as counselor. His time will not permit, and the economic pressures of his profession are so great that while he may be in a very profitable position, he is still not of a mind or of the ability to devote the hours and hours to family practice that distinguished the physician of 100 years ago. He is no longer close to his patients. He is no longer their father confessor. For that reason, the sick are now deprived almost completely of sympathetic counseling. The only thing they can hope for is professional counseling, and this does not take the place of the old family friend, for it is this family friend that becomes the symbol of God, becomes the symbol of the true father confessor, to whom the troubled soul can unburden itself. The church, recognizing this need throughout its numerous denominations, is now attempting to build a program of release from stress through religion, a formal indoctrination of the importance of combining religious principles with psychological techniques. Not long ago, we saw a book that was rather unusual, outstanding in this field, and shows the full degree in which this trend is moving. It is called Psychology for the Priest, and was written under the imperator of the Archbishop of Quebec. It is a work for Roman Catholic priests and contains copious extracts from Sigmund Freud. Obviously, those parts of psychology which conflict with Catholicism are not emphasized, but the priest is expected to have certain counseling abilities and is required to make use of modern knowledge in assisting his parishioner. This shows the swing after nearly 2,000 years back again to the concept that the temple is also the hospital, that the temple is the place where the individual seeks help through an effort to come closer to an internal integration. This integration was more advanced, perhaps, by the gradual arising of a monotheism in the West than by any other single factor. It made available to man a simple concept of God as Father, and also gave him the means of transferring his total destiny away from himself. Now, what does this literally mean in the fact of the matter? And how does it fit, for example, into certain philosophical systems? Does this concept actually violate, we will say, the Buddhist position that each individual must work out his own salvation with diligence? Actually, it does not conflict. It conflicts only if we do not think both through. Inasmuch as the individual, in the working out of his own salvation, can only accomplish the complete and total integration of himself through some catalyzing agent, some principle by means of which he finds himself in the presence of a sustaining power superior to his own. As long as the individual does not believe in such a power, he has not the integrative agent that he requires. Now, different faiths and philosophies may offer different expressions or interpretations of this power. Buddhism, for example, instead of calling this power God, calls it the doctrine, or, as we have likely translated it, the law. To the Buddhist, security lies in an invincible pattern of realities. All of these realities essentially good. And security is derived from man's conscious attainment of identity with these realities. Thus, these realities constitute the tremendous framework of strength. The individual is still not the strong one. But in Buddhism, which is essentially a rationalistic concept, this strength is vested in the inevitable working of universal law. The individual is taught that if he will obey this law, his security is inevitable. If he disobeys this law, he loses that security. So in this case, as far as therapy is concerned, prayer takes the form of the effort of the individual to experience identity with this law. Prayer is his effort to experience identity with God. Meditation, contemplation in Eastern disciplines are the effort of the individual to attune himself, to adjust his nature, to identify himself with these immovable, inevitable, unchangeable truths that are the source of infinite security. Perhaps in substance, the ends are the same. But in both cases, the individual gains the solution by the recognition of the presence of a superior agent. As we go through the definitions of the Buddhist definitions of universal principles, we might almost say that they would make a very good definition of God. Because these principles are good, they are all powerful, they are all wise, they are all compassionate. And this almost exhausts the concept of God. More than that, and perhaps most immediately important, is the immediate availability of these powers or forces. In Buddhism, the law that man seeks is within him, around him, everywhere. In theology, it is conceivable and usually advocated that deity is omniscient, omnipresent, omniactive. Therefore, everywhere, everything. In him we live and move and have our being. Thus, the proximity of the saving power, whatever it may be, comes to us when we change a basic concept toward God. And this happened gradually in the rise and unfoldment of the Christian faith for Western people, and in other faiths for other peoples. The concept of the remote Father, the God seated in a throne beyond the heavens, gradually gave way to the mystical concept of the God in everything, of everything. And by degrees, most people have learned to take the attitude that a God or a spark of God or a presence of God is within each human soul and is therefore the source of its life and light. The deity is therefore never more remote than man is distant from himself. That there can be no question of a God so far away that it cannot hear the voice of its supplicants. This is the same principle that we have in philosophy under these other names, and perhaps even in science. When Sir James Jeans finally admitted that the concept of a material universe was no longer tenable to the individual, that it was necessary to recognize that this entire fabric is sustained by universal or cosmic intelligence everywhere present, it is approximately a statement of the same inevitable experienced requirement of mankind. So under the name of the doctrine, or of the law, or of God, or of truth, or of energy, or of life, of essence, of principle, of being, under all these names, man has gradually come to know not only God as his creator, but God as his savior, as something immediate in himself, and therefore available under certain conditions. It then became the problem of philosophy and religion to determine the nature of those conditions by means of which this availability could be realized and transformed into actuality. In Eastern religions, meditation, contemplation, and the individual's relaxed seeking, his letting go of self, became his means of reaching the infinite. The infinite could not express itself, could not release its own power except in silence, or except in peace or tranquility. Therefore, confusion divided man from God. Confusion in the world obscured the laws of God in their operation in nature. Confusion within man obscured the operation of the divine law within himself. To find God, therefore, one must become unconfused. One must attain to a condition of dynamic simplicity, or of directness, or of organization, in which conflict no longer existed. Now, there are very few things that will induce an individual to renounce conflict, because his life is built upon it. His greatest need must therefore be his greatest inducement. Sickness is one of the great needs of mankind, extreme grief, loss, deprivation of something of the greatest importance, as the death of a near loved one. This may also be a powerful factor. But usually the individual does not become quiet unless he is suffering. He does not seek beyond what he has unless what he has reveals its immediate and inevitable insufficiency. So in the East, the concept of seeking God is through this concept of being still, to know the presence of the eternal, to relinquish self, to renounce self, to abandon the concerns of self, and to cling only to this supreme conviction of the availability of the divine power. This was the foundation of mysticism, which departed from all formal theology on the grounds, as in the case of the Friends and the Quakers, that this power came to the individual through the simple, pious, natural devotion of his own heart. In these ways, then, the path or way to God was clarified, and all peoples in all parts of the world who have reached certain culture levels have come into common agreement on this. Namely, that only the humble, the contrite, only those in whose hearts there is the instinct of the little child, coming with faith and without doubt, only those who have attained a certain victory over themselves can experience the immediate presence of the deity. It is obvious that either the Eastern or Western mystic, so impelled, would come to a similar conclusion through visualization, through his mudras and his mantrams, through his formalized meditations and retrospections. Eastern man seeks to attain the total visualization of deity. He seeks to know, through the strange ecstasy of the spirit, this immediate presence of God. And great mystics like Sri Ramakrishna have attained to such a high degree of this sensitivity that even their disciples sometimes feared for the lives of their teachers under the strange ecstasy of this sense of identity with the eternal. Western man, less emotional, less dramatic in his presentation of concepts, has, however, sought the same degree of devotion through honest prayer. And Western mysticism has pointed out that prayer is not merely a statement of words, that it is not a ritual or a formula in the common sense of the terms. It is actually an experience of God seeking. It is an experience of the individual attempting to speak his heart across the mysterious interval that separates him from his own source. Thus, in the degree that this is true, genuine, complete, in the degree that absolute humility and absolute integrity are present, to that degree prayer becomes the tremendous therapeutic agent, the carrier of an experience of the soul that can be most cathartic to any injury, sickness, deformity, or misery of the flesh. It becomes, in a sense, a complete cleansing. It changes the direction of psychic current within the body. It causes a life principle to blaze up, and in so doing, like a kind of electrical current, to burn out the material which is false or which is unsuitable to be maintained in the human economy. Thus, in prayer, we have a modification of the energy fields which lie back of man, not because it is a ritual or a formula which is descended from our ancestors, but only in terms of its vital significance to ourselves. If it is complete in its expression of our unconditioned acceptance of the divine will, it may and frequently does produce what we might commonly conceive to be a miracle. Certainly it produces one of two ends, if it is true and proper. It either helps the condition to improve, or helps the individual to sustain himself through the condition. In one way or another, it advances his common good, and gives him further resources with which to face whatever emergencies may lie ahead. So through God as Father, and through the power of man to experience or reach this universal good, the individual comes under the influence of a tremendous dynamic which breaks through the static which is often the cause of his trouble. Naturally, under such conditions, if his prayer receives apparently fulfillment, his faith is proportionately magnified, and his sense of well-being may often be infinitely prolonged as well as enlarged. On the other hand, we have to recognize that prayer healing, or faith healing as it is called, does not always have permanent results. Where it is impermanent, however, it usually means that the faith was not in the individual, but was imposed upon him by another. This is true quite often in what we call faith healing, for there are certain persons, some of whom undoubtedly are gifted in one way or another, who, believing in a ministry of healing, go forth and cause a considerable change in the psychic lives of the persons who come under their influence. Mass healing meetings and things of that nature on a religious level cause a powerful hysteria. The individuals for the moment are picked up by faith, but it is a faith which is vested largely in the person in whom they believe. This person, through playing upon their emotions, causes a powerful climax, much as is described in the story of Mesmer and his magnetic tub. And under this we have a very strong psychic change. The individual feels better. Perhaps his infirmity symptoms are almost completely blocked or appear to vanish. But gradually, as time goes on, the vividness of the experience fails, because the experience was not really his own. It is something on which he has learned to depend again upon an outside agent of some kind, in this case the healer. Under such conditions, as the healer did not instruct him or make it possible for him to fully develop his own resources of faith, the faith fades, the ailments or the symptoms seem to return. It is therefore, as both Buddha and Western mystics have pointed out, of the utmost importance that these disciplines or these mysteries of faith be totally experienced by the individual. Otherwise, they cannot succeed. Another interesting point that comes in connection with this is the importance that we always realize, which results from the individual moving his center of consciousness away from himself. On a comparatively simple human level, for example, singers who become self-conscious nearly always have trouble with their voices. The throat will close. The public speaker who becomes self-conscious finds it difficult to frame his words and will usually develop a husky throat. Nearly anyone who becomes self-conscious becomes tense. Wherever there is tension, there is interference with function. The human being lives in an almost perpetual state of self-consciousness, and therefore almost constant tension. While this self-consciousness dominates, while self-interest, self-purpose, self-aggrandizement, self-ambition, while these are constantly focusing the individual upon his own nature, he is very easily locked, tied, and restricted, and this may well affect his entire health, because the human body is mostly an autonomic instrument and functions best when we think least about it. That is, assuming that we have basically reasonable attitudes. I've never known an individual yet whose mind was on diet from morning till night who was not sick. I've never known an individual who spent all his time talking about health who was ever well. Or an individual who was constantly trying to conquer either life around him or the universe, who was not under a state of constant tension and suffering from poor health. The individual whose mind is too positively and aggressively focused upon the attainment of his own purposes is always a likely candidate for health problems. If, however, for some reason or other, his mind is removed from himself, he will do much better. This is the basis of nature's natural recuperative power, which we call sleep. Sleep is that state in which we are the least damaging to ourselves, where pressures and tensions become temporarily unimportant. We were a little slow, but we appreciate it. And in those conditions, we find recuperation. Now, it is not absolutely necessary to be unconscious in order to relax, but it seems to help. If, however, we remove the center of attention from ourselves, we give the body and the emotions and even the mind a greatly desired opportunity to fall into their own natural, normal relationships without artificial interference by the mind or emotions under tension. It is therefore quite noticeable, for example, that some of the most remarkable changes have happened where the individual, for some reason or other, forgot himself. Now, to forget yourself by a direct effort of the self is exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. The more you tell yourself not to think about yourself, the more you're building yourself up. Therefore, a complete devotion or dedication to some not self-objective is the easiest answer to many problems. Take a hypochondriac, for example, one of these individuals who has a mass of symptoms. They have been doctrine for them for years, and for every symptom they obscure, 3 new ones appear. Yet these individuals are factually more sick because of the fear of sickness than because of anything wrong with them. I've known cases where a hypochondriac has had a perfectly wonderful time with their symptoms for half a lifetime, and then someone whom they really cared for really became sick. And this hypochondriac suddenly found that he had a purpose in life. He had to get up and take care of someone worse off than himself. In a few weeks he was well. His own symptoms disappeared because his symptoms were actually aggravated loneliness, aggravated lack of real outlets and purposefulness. He was a hypochondriac thinking about himself because actually he had nothing better to think about. That's a pretty poor substitute also for real interest. Having found a real interest, he became vitally improved. This is why simple affection is so important, and why the good God is also a God of love. Because love is without question one of the most therapeutic emotions that we associate with religion. The only love that won't help us is self-love. Almost any other kind is beneficial. Love is a decentralizing of the objective personality. In any term of true affection, we are placing the good, the interest, the well-being, the security, the happiness of something or someone else above our own. Without this consideration, there is no genuine affection. And as we do this, we instinctively center our attention upon that other person. They become more important than we are. This in itself will heal many sicknesses, simply because so much sickness is due to too small a circle of personal experience. The most abstract, the most powerful, and yet the most readily available object of affection to man is his God concept. Nearly any one whom he loves may disappoint him, may disillusion him, may in a way betray him. But because his God concept is inevitable, God cannot betray him. God cannot disillusion him, because he is incapable of the conception of such a thing. Therefore, affection devoted to the highest contemplation of truth, unless it is too closely associated with a disillusioning theology, the direct love of God on the mystical level always represents the purest affection that man can know. There are 2 forms of affection, as one of the ancient Greeks observed, that come very near to purity. One is the love of God, and the other is the love to a newborn child. These things are as nearly unselfish as we know, and therefore most highly therapeutic. So man's love of God becomes man's centering of his consciousness in God, and therefore its removal from his own field of ego. Under these conditions, he becomes less concerned about himself. He becomes more concerned about other values. As the martyr who cheerfully died for his religion, so the individual, though not perhaps on the level of martyrdom, cheerfully lives a new code for his conviction. In so doing, he achieves also a catharsis. He achieves a purification of his own life through the simple process of relaxation. Self-will is at the root of tension, and because of self-will or pride, so fell the angels. And the motion away from self-will toward the divine will is therefore a complete resigning of the directives of the individual to such codes of principles as may reside within the deepest parts of his own consciousness. In other words, under this influence, the best in him takes over. And as the best in him is seldom the cause of his trouble, and his trouble usually results from the fact that he has ignored the best in him, the result is beneficial. Out of the total picture, therefore, of all these circumstances and elements and others, has come the concept of God as the physician. Not so much simply because of what deity has done, but because of what the faith in deity can do to us. Not so much because we have proof that God has delivered remedies, but because the faith itself is the sovereign remedy in its own right. Faith has helped more than any other medicine known to man. And faith, once established, occupies another important part in the healing procedure. Faith, if sustained, if actually integrated and made the dynamic of life, so that it remains a continuing operating power in the source of self, becomes a magnificent preventive agent. Man does not become sick because he is good. There may be times in which his goodness may not completely protect him, because his goodness is itself imperfect. But such goodness as is available to him is a protection according to its own degree. And the development of the power to recognize a divine agent and align oneself with that which is superior to the person, and thereby release pressure. All these things are good. Now we find in the New Testament, for example, that we are admonished to seek first the kingdom of heaven and its righteousness, and all other things shall be added unto us. You see, that is the reverse of our present policy, because most people have decided that after all other things have been added, they will then retire and seek the kingdom of heaven. By that time, however, they have collapsed from duodenal ulcers or have had completely eliminating thrombosis. So they never get around to it. It is true, undoubtedly, that the fact that the individual, through his faith, is caused to modify his standard of values, generally, is therapeutic. Faith may cause an individual to live more simply as a person, to be less dissipated, to be less concerned with the fashions and foibles of his time. Faith and simplicity of living may often go together. And here we have an interesting parallel between what you might term religion and common sense. Now, in the Muslim world, for example, the feast and fasting of Ramadan has a significance that perhaps is a little more than merely religious convention, because many religious rules are grounded in human experience. It's therefore customary for the Muslim to have certain periods of fasting. He says that he fasts because of his religion. Perhaps he does. But he is also doing himself a tremendous favor on a level of physical economy. The Muslim is, under normal conditions, when he can get it, a rather heavy eater. He enjoys the good things of life. So his religion imposes upon him certain restraints, including a restraint on gluttony. He has to go without so many days, so often. That's his religion. Hinduism, for example, even in a country where difficulties exist in these matters, has a strange emphasis upon cleanliness, which can have a big effect upon health. We probably would not have had the bubonic plague in Europe during the medieval period if religion had included the necessity of properly disposing of the garbage. But it didn't include that. But a Hindu, before he can engage in prayer, if he is a true Hindu, must bathe. It's a religious duty. He must put on a clean cloth. And he must see that his body is clean. Now his religion tells him that he must pray every day. What happens? He gets a bath every day. At a time when the Western world considered it sufficient to visit the old tin tub on Saturday night. So many religions, in their limitation of foods in diet, limitations upon excesses of all kinds, teaching moderations, inviting periodic fastings and vigils, and making a virtue of pilgrimage, or the individual simply setting his life aside and saying, this is the time to go to Mecca. For this long, difficult, and for the average Muslim expensive journey, there is no substitute in his faith. It is important. It is more important than business. So he has the experience of setting aside all of the familiar works, starting out perhaps on foot or in some inadequate, crowded conveyance to make the long and difficult journey to Mecca. He is going solely and completely for the good of his soul. He is going because his spirit needs it. Very few Western persons ever put themselves out religiously to the degree that a Muslim does when he makes a journey to Mecca. We get into our new car, ride to church, wish the sermon was shorter, and plan a picnic for the afternoon. We do not experience the vitality of a real devotion. Needless to say, when a Muslim reaches Mecca, if he has the wonderful and almost unbelievable privilege of kissing the black stone of Abraham, he may whisper to that stone all the infirmities, the sicknesses, and the sins of his life, for in that instant, all is made new again. For when he has made this pilgrimage, he remembers how it happened that his prophet Muhammad, when a small child, was visited by the angel Jibreel, and this angel, reaching into the heart of the child, took out the black drop of original sin. And at the kissing of the stone of Abraham, he is adding his sins to those which have made the stone turn black. It is the stone now that must carry the sin. even as it was once the pillar of Jacob in the wilderness. So in this, the Muslim has had an experience of tradition and belief, and an experience of personal effort. When he returns from the pilgrimage, he may twist a green veil around his turban, and he is a stranger, new estate in the community. He is a man who has made the journey, who has fulfilled the rules of his faith. Now, it may be that he is full of ulterior motives. Maybe all he ever wanted was the green veil around his turban so other people would admire him. But that is up to him. If that is his motive, that is all he got. But if he really believed, he had an experience. And many of those who were feeble, aged, broken in body and diseased, who started on that pilgrimage, reached Mecca alive when any doctor said they could not do so. They could not die until they had reached the house of their faith. Life would not let go, because to die there was to die in full peace, in full assurance of salvation. So these different beliefs affect us. They affect every part of our bodily and psychological chemistry. The fear of God gave man a certain kind of strength, which helped him. The love of God gives him another kind of strength, which helps him more. And perhaps someday the understanding of God will give him perfect strength. Who knows? But in any event, the belief in God has opened to millions of people a way of internal health, a way of acceptances, which has made it possible for them to endure and survive innumerable problems that might have seemed insurmountable. And in this thinking, we do realize psychological and philosophical factors. We do not know where to draw the line. If we are religious people, we do believe that in perfect faith we fulfill the law, that we keep it, and therefore that the law will keep us. We believe completely in the availability of a universal power of good, that if we can reach that power and can release it through ourselves, we not only increase and enrich our own beings, but we fulfill the reason and purpose for existence and become instruments of an eternal plan. To therefore achieve this attunement becomes the great purpose of living, a purpose too easily forgotten in this busy world in which we now live. Perhaps we are sick because we are too busy to remember truth. Perhaps the reason why every remedy that is given to us on a medical level in some way short-circuits itself. Everything that we solve brings us new mysteries. Today we have more remedies than ever before in history and more sickness. We cannot win on this ground alone. We cannot win until man gives himself, gives his own inner life to these principles. And the one concept or conviction that has impelled man more insistently to give himself than any other has been his God concept. Therefore, it has become the basis of nearly all religious healing. And religious healing has still tremendous power in areas where natural faith is strong. Miracles occur mostly to simple people. They occur to those who have not become too heavily indoctrinated with success or attitudes of self-sufficiency. The simple, the meek, have not only a good chance of inheriting the earth, but they have a good chance of outliving those of more complicated natures. Therefore, we should seek simplicity, seek directness, and seek to reduce the confusions of our own living, for by so doing we attain health. If we relax constructively, if we keep good principles before our minds, if we seek truth and seek beauty, Try to love unselfishly and sincerely and perform all of these good duties. What are we doing? We are worshiping. For these are the things that our good God has told us to do. And He has told us that if we do these things, He will be with us, that He will strengthen us, and that His Spirit will guide us, and that His light in us will show us the way to the things that are right and proper. This is actually the essence of religion. That man, by keeping the law, shall experience the nature of his God, and through this experience shall perfect his life. If these things be true, then they represent not only religion, but health. They are not only the answer to man's moral need, they are the most perfect therapy in the world. This was the conviction, and it has endured, and I think it forms a natural second level or degree of our consideration. So we prepare this as the foundation for our discussion next week. And I might call to your mind that if you're interested in taking this series of lectures, either for credits for our courses, or wish to sign the attendance cards, and wish to make it a serious project, that on the level of a serious project, our textbook, Healing, should be included. And if you are expecting or preparing to prepare a paper on this course, the textbook Healing is required reading, so that we leave it to your discretion. We demand nothing, but we recommend strongly that if you wish to make the most of these courses and these lessons, that you do some appropriate reading in addition to attending. And we thank you very much